The first shift had barely begun when a voice shattered the air. "Don't touch that table." The words hit like a slap loud enough to stop forks halfway to mouths. Every eye turned toward the new worker frozen with a cloth in his hand, caught mid-step as if guilty of some crime. The waitress glared, her tone dripping with contempt. No one intervened. Not the staff who lowered their heads, not the customers who stared in uncomfortable silence. The table stood gleaming, marked as something untouchable, as if sacred. But sacred to whom and why humiliation clung to the air, heavier than the silence itself. One rule had been made clear: he was not welcome to cross a line only she seemed to own. Anger stirred. Curiosity burned. It was just a table, yet it already carried the weight of a secret big enough to break the room apart. The new uniform hung loosely on him, creased and tired as though it had lived another life before clinging to his shoulders. Compared to the crisp shirts and polished aprons around him, he looked out of place like a shadow misplaced under the light. His hands shook against the tray, each glass rattling in soft protest as he shuffled forward with hesitant steps. The rhythm of the restaurant seemed effortless for everyone else, but for him it was a storm he could barely stand against. A glance from the waitress sliced through him, sharp with disdain, the kind of look that reduces someone without a word. Nearby, a group of diners noticed the stumble in his stride. They exchanged half-smiles, the kind that humiliate without sound. In that moment, pity began to grow, not from his own posture, but from the unspoken cruelty of the eyes that measured him. The audience felt the weight of being unwanted. The image was clear, simple, unforgettable. A man, swallowed by a role beneath him, mocked not for failure, but for weakness others wanted to see. He steadied the tray and lowered it toward the table. A single glass tipped, teetering on the edge of disaster, but stopped short of spilling. Relief was brief. The waitress pounced, her voice dripping with scorn. "Haven't you ever worked a day in your life?" The words struck like arrows designed not to correct but to shame. His jaw tightened, yet no anger passed his lips. Before the silence thickened further, another voice slipped through, soft, almost secret. A younger employee leaned close and whispered, "Don't mind her, she's always like that." The contrast was stark. In a place where cruelty echoed loudly, kindness existed only in hushed tones, fragile but luminous. His eyes softened, though his smile masked the sting. The scene exposed the division between dominance and compassion, between those who exploit and those who quietly resist. For the viewer, the moment carried weight beyond humiliation. It planted a seed of balance. Even in the darkest corner, light flickered, however faint. That flicker would matter later. Later, away from the clatter of dishes and the sting of voices, he revealed a truth to the unseen audience. "I started from exactly here," he confessed, voice low but steady. "The bottom, the forgotten shifts, the endless demands. I came back to see if anything had changed or if the same shadows still lingered." The confession turned the image upside down. He was not merely a lost man fumbling through trays. He was the one who owned the roof above them, the man who signed the checks now hidden in plain sight. Folding napkins with quiet care, bending lower than anyone expected, he became both invisible and omnipresent. What others mocked as incompetence was in fact a deliberate step into memory. Curiosity ignited. Why would a man of authority bury himself in this disguise? What truth was he searching for? The paradox, unsettled yet intrigued, opening a question larger than the room itself. The order was simple, yet when the plates arrived, they were wrong. Confusion spread across the table, forks paused mid-air. The family called the waitress back, their voices calm but firm. She didn't hesitate, she pointed to the man carrying the tray. "It's his fault. He can't follow the simplest instructions." Eyes shifted toward him. He bowed slightly, whispering an apology that wasn't his to give. No protest, no defense, just quiet acceptance. Around the room, employees exchanged glances. Some clenched their jaws, others looked down at the floor. They knew the truth, but no one dared to voice it. Silence thickened until it became complicity. He carried the weight, absorbing blame he hadn't earned, shoulders bent, yet steady. The audience felt the sting of injustice deepen the frustration of watching cruelty thrive unchecked. The moment didn't end cleanly. It left a question hanging: how much more humiliation would he bear before something broke? Later, he moved slowly from table to tablecloth in hand, wiping surfaces with deliberate care. The waitress cut across his path, voice sharp enough to scratch "Hurry up, or the customers will grow old waiting." Her tone invited laughter, but no one laughed. As he leaned over to reach a glass, it wobbled on the edge. For a breath, disaster loomed. Then his hand steadied it, quick and precise. The glass rested safely once more. A ripple of approval spread, light claps from the diner's soft smiles offered in quiet thanks. Their recognition was brief but sincere, a rare moment where dignity wasn't stolen but restored. The waitress's expression, darkened lips pressed tight. Her power slipped, if only for a heartbeat. For the first time, the viewers tasted a subtle justice skill meeting chance cruelty eclipsed by grace. The memory fixed itself a small triumph standing against a tide of contempt. The next task was beneath anyone's pride, yet he accepted it without complaint, cleaning the restroom. With bucket and rag, he disappeared inside. Outside, the waitress leaned against the wall phone, raised laughter spilling as she streamed the scene live. "Here's our golden rookie." She mocked her words delivered for strangers watching on glowing screens. Snickers crackled through the phone, friends laughing at a man who bent silently to his work. On his knees, he scrubbed the tiles, every movement steady, unhurried without bitterness. The contrast was brutal mockery echoing online while perseverance remained unseen. Staff passed by, glancing quickly away, unwilling to interfere. He never looked up, not once, his focus fixed on the task. Viewers could feel the sting sharpened humiliation had now left the room and entered the world outside. The cruelty no longer whispered, it was broadcast. And still he endured, setting the stage for tension yet to come. Break came quietly, the din of plates and voices fading into a softer hum. He sat alone, tray balanced on the edge of the table, food untouched for a long while. Then the younger employee approached, hesitant but sincere, sliding into the seat across from him. The words that followed were simple, yet heavy with truth. "I'm working nights like this, to cover my tuition. If I don't, I can't stay in school." His voice wavered, not from weakness but from the strain of carrying a dream on fragile shoulders. The older man listened, eyes steady, nodding slowly as though every syllable mattered. For a brief moment, the weight of humiliation lifted. Here was a glimpse of honesty, of sacrifice, born from hope. The ugliness of the day stood in sharper relief against it. One light in a dark place, faint yet unmistakable. The viewers felt it. Cruelty may be loud, but kindness endures, and when it does appear, it changes everything. The moment of quiet cracked. The waitress walked by, her words sharp enough to slice through the fragile peace. "Sitting here flirting instead of working, huh?" Her tone carried mockery designed to wound not one, but both. The younger worker stiffened, cheeks flushed, crimson eyes cast down to the table. He swallowed hard, guiltless, yet shamed. The older man froze, lips pressed together, unable to answer without drawing more fire. Around them, silence thickened again, uncomfortable, suffocating. The kindness shared seconds before dissolved under the weight of cruelty. For the audience, the scene hit harder than insult alone. It was the public exposure, the humiliation dragged into daylight. Conflict was no longer private, it spilled out where everyone could see. What had been a seed of warmth was now smothered by venom. And the viewer's frustration grew sharper, the question rising louder, how long before someone speaks against this abuse? At another table, a guest gave one clear request: no spice. The plate returned red with heat defiance hidden under sauce. He saw it happen, the deliberate choice, but his lips stayed sealed. Confrontation meant risk, and risk meant exposure he could not yet afford. The first bite brought coughs, then anger. The family demanded an answer. Without hesitation, the waitress shifted the blame again. He messed up. He doesn't listen. Faces turned toward him, eyes hard with frustration. He bowed, once more, apology spilling where protest should have been. Voices rose around the table, the sound of discontent swelling. And still management remained in the shadows, watching, doing nothing. That silence screamed louder than any insult. For the viewers, the unfairness had grown beyond one cruel voice. It was now protected, tolerated. The injustice was no longer an isolated act, it was a system unchallenged. And that realization hung heavy, unresolved, demanding a reckoning to come. The family arrived with 2 children, their chatter filling the air with a restless energy. Before they could settle, the waitress slammed the menus onto the table, her expression soured as though their presence was an inconvenience. The children quieted instantly, startled by the sound. Their parents exchanged an uneasy glance. He stepped forward, offering a soft smile, voice gentle. "I'm sorry about that. Please take your time." But his attempt at kindness was cut short. The waitress's eyes flashed her words sharp enough to silence the table. "Who told you to speak for me?" The sting hung there, dripping contempt directed not only at him but at the guests who had just witnessed it. The father forced a tight smile, trying to keep the peace for his children, but the air had already curdled. What should have been a simple welcome turned into discomfort, tension pressing against every chair. He had tried to bridge the gap, but cruelty built the wall higher. The audience felt it a man's effort to heal, smothered before it even began. Later, plates were placed before the guests, but the order was wrong. A mother asked politely, her tone calm. "This isn't what we asked for." Instead of fixing it, the waitress folded her arms, dismissing the complaint with a careless shrug. "Eat it or don't. I'm busy." Her voice carried loud enough for nearby tables to hear. Faces tightened, whispers stirred, but no one intervened. He stood nearby, tray still in his grip, frozen between duty and fear. His chest ached with the knowledge of what had just unfolded, yet silence bound him. The guest sighed, defeated, and began eating what they hadn't chosen. The injustice rang louder than any raised voice. A simple error could have been corrected with grace, but instead it was twisted into open disdain. The viewers saw the insult for what it was, not a mistake, but a statement. A customer had been treated as disposable, and he could do nothing but witness it. At another table, an elderly man sat quietly, his hand trembling as he tried to grasp the utensils. The effort was slow, each movement revealing the struggle of a body no longer steady. Before anyone could assist, the waitress leaned closer, her voice cruel and cutting. "If you can't eat, then don't. Stop wasting time." The words struck harder than any slap. The old man froze, fork slipping from his grasp. His companions stared in disbelief, mouths open, yet speechless. Around the room, silence fell thick with shock. He stood rooted to the spot, heart-pounding breath caught in his chest. To watch weakness mocked so openly was unbearable. The audience felt the outrage boil fury at seeing dignity stripped from someone least able to defend himself. This was no longer rudeness, no longer impatience, it was deliberate cruelty. And in that cruelty the tension reached a new height, daring anyone to break the silence. He noticed the old man struggling, the fork slipping once again between unsteady fingers. Compassion pulled him forward. He reached, gently offering to steady the plate to make the moment less heavy. But before kindness could land, the waitress's hand cut across, shoving his arm away. "Who asked you to interfere?" She spat, her voice rising sharp enough for neighboring tables to hear. Heads turned. Guests nearby whispered, their discomfort swelling into audible disapproval. He stood, frozen heat rising in his chest, but his lips locked shut. Every instinct urged him to defend, yet the disguise chained him in silence. He turned, retreating into himself, anger swallowed whole. To the watchers, the cruelty was unbearable, kindness crushed before it could breathe, dignity denied where it was most needed. The scene ended, not with resolution, but with suffocation, a wall closing tighter. Evil held the ground, and goodness was forced back into the shadows. The next wave of guests arrived, a group filling half the room. Orders stacked, quickly, demands rising like a storm. The waitress raised her voice, barking instructions not at herself, but at him. "Carry this. Fetch that. Move faster." She stood, firm arms folded, never lifting a finger. He obeyed without protest, balancing trays stacked with plates, sweat breaking across his forehead, shirt clinging under the weight of effort. Back and forth he moved, nearly stumbling, yet she only pointed and commanded again. A few customers exchanged glances, shaking their heads, their eyes reflecting what others refused to say aloud. The image was striking, the man bent beneath labor, not his own, reduced a little more than a servant under another servant's cruelty. For the viewers, sympathy grew heavy, merging with quiet rage. It was no longer clumsiness that set him apart, it was deliberate exploitation, a portrait of silent suffering carved deep. When the shift finally slowed, exhaustion painted the room. Staff scattered to rest, but the waitress lingered in the corner, a small pile of folded bills spread before her. One by one she slipped the tips into her pocket eyes, darting to ensure no one objected. Yet others saw. Colleagues glanced from afar, lips pressed shut, their silence louder than protest. He watched, too, chest tightening, the truth undeniable. Tips meant for the group stolen into one hand without shame. He let out a quiet sigh, not from surprise, but from recognition. This was more than rudeness, more than arrogance. It was theft, plain and brazen, permitted by the silence of fear. For the audience, the paradox burned. Those who labored hardest received nothing, while the one who gave least collected everything. In that image, the unfairness crystallized, leaving no doubt. This was not a flaw of temperament. It was corruption laid bare. A customer raised a hand. voice calm but firm. The food on his plate was cold. It wasn't anger, just a simple request. Instead of an apology, the waitress snapped, "If you want it hot, go heat it yourself." The bluntness hit the table like a slap. The man froze fork, suspended, unsure whether to argue or leave. Standing nearby, he felt heat rise in his own cheeks, shame burning, though the insult wasn't his. He wanted to intervene to correct what had been broken, but fear pinned him silent. The customer set the fork down, shook his head slowly, and rose from the chair. Without another word, he left footsteps echoing heavier than they should have. The untouched food remained a symbol of arrogance driving business out the door. For the viewers, it was a wound deeper than rudeness. It was damage to the very purpose of service. And yet no consequence came, no correction, leaving tension unresolved, waiting to erupt further. The bell above the door chimed. A familiar figure walked in, one of the restaurant's regulars, greeted warmly by another member of staff. Smiles exchanged, a small ritual of recognition that had survived many visits. But the moment fractured when the waitress passed by, her lips curling with disdain. "Here comes the complainer again," she muttered, loud enough to be heard. The words struck not just the guest but the atmosphere itself, souring it in an instant. He caught every syllable ears sharp, though he kept his face still, expression neutral. Inside, the weight pressed harder. Each cruelty seemed no longer accidental, but habitual, woven into every encounter. The regular paused, shoulders tightening, a faint shadow crossing his face. Respect, once offered freely, was replaced with quiet insult. For the audience, the sting deepened. This wasn't about one rude exchange, but a pattern unchecked, a culture bending toward contempt. The ladder of emotion climbed higher, anger layering upon disgust, preparing for something to snap. Later, he carried a tray, heavy with plates, arms tense, careful with every step. The waitress stepped deliberately into his path, blocking the narrow aisle. The tray tilted, liquid sloshed, and with one slip, water spilled across the floor. Her reaction was immediate, her voice sharp and piercing. "You're useless. Look at the mess you made." Heads turned. Customers fixed their gaze on him, not her, their judgment steered by her accusation. Kneeling quickly, he reached for a cloth, mopping the floor while whispers buzzed above him. The sting wasn't in the spill, it was in the lie. The deliberate sabotage spun into humiliation. His shoulders bent, lower face hidden, but every movement carried the weight of silent rage. For those watching, the injustice seared. The cruelty had shifted from private insult to public shaming staged in front of strangers. And still, he bore it quietly, the tension stretching tighter, pulling the story toward a breaking point that could not be delayed much longer. Break returned the air softer, but venom still lingered. He sat quietly, resting his hands, when the waitress's voice sliced through the lull. "Old people aren't worth serving. They don't tip, they complain they're a waste of space." Her words carried across the room, bitter, unapologetic. Other staff froze, eyes flicking down, pretending they hadn't heard. No one challenged her. No one dared. He remained still, but his face darkened, shadow settling over his features. It was no longer impatience or arrogance. It was contempt, laid bare discrimination spoken without hesitation. Each syllable left a stain heavier than silence. For the watchers, it was the breaking point. Kindness could be excused as weakness, mistakes could be explained away, but hatred spoken so plainly could not be ignored. The picture fixed itself, one woman spitting disdain, an entire room, complicit in silence, and one man holding his anger like a storm beneath the surface. Later, a young mother entered, her child resting heavy in her arms. She asked softly for another chair, balancing fatigue with patience. The waitress scowled, words sharp as a lash. "This isn't a daycare. Handle it yourself." The cruelty hung in the air, callous and unnecessary. Before silence could grow heavier, he moved. Without pause, he carried a chair, setting it gently beside the table. The mother's expression shifted, relief, gratitude, a smile blooming despite exhaustion. "Thank you," she whispered, her eyes speaking more than words. Around them, tension eased for a breath, kindness reclaiming a small corner of the room. The waitress's face tightened, power slipping again. For the audience, the scene built another step on the ladder of emotion, outrage for the cruelty, warmth for the compassion. The line between the two became sharper, clearer. The contrast promised more to come, preparing the ground for conflict that could no longer be contained. Then came the moment that tied everything back to the beginning. She pointed toward a table at the far end, her voice cutting clean, the VIP section. He obeyed, moving carefully, cloth in hand. But the instant his hand touched the polished wood, her voice erupted louder than before. I told you don't touch that table." The words crashed against the walls, startling guests into silence. Heads turned, eyes narrowing in confusion. At the table, the guests themselves looked up surprised, curious at the sudden explosion. He froze, cloth still against the surface, heart pounding. The air thickened heavier than at any point before. The mystery of the untouchable table returned, pressing harder, demanding answers. Why this table? Why such fury? Viewers leaned in tension, now stretched to breaking. The secret hinted at the start had circled back, larger and darker, ready to break open. And nothing could feel ordinary after this moment. The raised voice of the waitress echoed again, sharp enough to cut through the chatter of guests. This time, the manager appeared from the back, drawn by the commotion. For a moment, hope flickered, perhaps authority would restore order. But instead of intervening, his lips curved into a faint smile, a gesture of dismissal as if nothing worth noting had happened. His presence should have carried weight, yet it dissolved into indifference. The staff, who had witnessed everything, glanced at one another, disappointment etched into their faces. Their silence deepened, heavy with resignation. He observed closely, the truth sinking deeper. The cruelty was not a lone act, it was tolerated, even shielded. A leader who should protect had instead chosen to ignore, siding not with justice, but with convenience. For the viewers, the realization stung sharply. This was more than a rude waitress, it was a system feeding her power. And seeds of rebellion began to stir. The room tightened with tension as she carried a tray of drinks. With a careless flick, liquid splashed across a guest's shirt. Gasps rose, eyes turned, and before responsibility could land, she pointed her finger. "It's his fault. The clumsy new guy." The words shot like darts, dragging him into the center of shame. He rushed forward, cloth in hand, bowing deeply as he wiped at the table, apologizing for something he hadn't done. The guest's expression hardened. Brows, drawn lips pressed thin. Whispers rippled through the room, customers watching as he bent lower, his dignity stripped once more. Above him, her voice still rang, laced with scorn. He clenched the rag tighter, knuckles pale, anger twisting inside, yet sealed behind silence. For those watching, the scene was unbearable injustice, magnified cruelty applauded by inaction and humiliation, broadcast to an entire room. The conflict had reached its sharpest edge, a breaking point carved in front of everyone. The cruelty did not pause. At another table sat an elderly guest, shoulders, frail voice trembling as he asked for patience. Her reply was venom disguised as words, "You're too slow. Stop wasting my time." The man flinched, lips parting, but no sound escaping. He sat, frozen shame draped across his face. That was the final fracture. The disguised boss could no longer stand still. He stepped forward, his voice steady but firm, slicing through the silence. "That's enough. He doesn't deserve to be treated this way." The words hung heavy, vibrating in the air. Conversation stopped, forks lowered, the entire room locked in stillness. All eyes shifted, tension now wound so tight it felt ready to snap. The waitress blinked, stunned by the defiance. Something had changed. For the viewers, the moment was electric, a countdown beginning. They knew a revelation loomed, and nothing about this night would remain hidden much longer. The room froze after his words cut through the chaos. Chairs stopped creaking, forks hovered in mid-air, conversations silenced by a single act of defiance. For a heartbeat, all sound was gone, only the weight of his challenge pressing down. The waitress broke the stillness with a laugh, harsh and brittle. "You're just a nobody, a clumsy rookie. Keep your mouth shut." The insult landed heavy, but this time it did not scatter him. Guests shifted uncomfortably, some shaking their heads in disbelief, unwilling to watch another moment of cruelty. In the corner, the young worker who had shown kindness earlier lifted his eyes, worry etched deep as though he sensed something more was about to unfold. The man breathed in slowly, chest rising with a calm not born of fear, but of resolve. The silence stretched, long taut as a rope ready to snap. Viewers felt it too. Something irreversible was seconds away. The stillness shattered not with words, but with movement. His hand reached up, sliding the glasses from his face. They were plain ordinary until they were gone. Next, he pulled away the old cap-worn fabric crumpling in his grip. Beneath it, hair neatly styled, incongruent with the disguise he had worn all evening. Gasps rippled through the staff, recognition stirring like sparks catching flame. The younger employee whispered, voice trembling but clear enough to be heard. "He's the boss." The sentence fell like a stone in water, sending waves through every corner of the room. The waitress's smirk faltered, freezing into something brittle, unnatural. Her posture stiffened, eyes wide, disbelief battling panic. In that moment, the disguise was gone, the truth undeniable. He had been watching, enduring, recording everything with his silence, and now the mask had fallen. For the viewers, it was the moment they had been waiting for, the twist earned through every wound endured. Whispers spread like wildfire across the tables. Some customers leaned toward each other, recalling headlines, faces from articles, the name attached to the man now standing before them. Recognition lit their eyes. This wasn't just another worker, it was the one who signed every paycheck, the figure behind the brand. The waitress stood, rooted, color draining from her face, her body a statue carved in shock. He let the murmurs swell before speaking, his voice calm yet heavy, every word landing with finality. "I am not a new hire. I run this place." The statement cracked through the room like thunder, leaving no space for denial. Gasps, mutters, and stares followed the collective realization, crashing down on everyone present. Authority, once hidden, had returned in full view. For the audience, the image seared into memory, a man stripped of disguise, standing, unshaken, words forged in steel. It was the sound of power reclaimed and justice about to begin. He turned toward the young worker, the one whose kindness had been quiet but constant through the night. His voice, steady and clear, carried across the room. "You were the only one who chose to help." The words fell heavy with meaning, and immediately the silence broke into applause. Hands came together, first in scattered claps, then in waves of recognition. The waitress lowered her head, shoulders stiff, sweat collecting at her temples. For the first time, she was no longer shielded by silence, her cruelty stood naked against the sound of approval for another. At that very moment, the manager stepped forward, his expression strained jaw, tight eyes, flickering with unease. He had walked in before with indifference, but now the room was charged, and no indifference could survive. The audience leaned closer, breath held. Recognition had been given to the good, and the next step was inevitable exposure of the one who had failed to lead. The applause faded, leaving only the hum of tension. The boss fixed his gaze on the manager, each word deliberate. "How many complaints have you heard?" The manager faltered, voice shrinking into the floor. "I thought it wasn't serious." The excuse wilted instantly. Another worker, emboldened by the moment, spoke out, "We've reported it over and over. Nothing was ever done." Murmurs rose, confirmation spreading like fire catching dry grass. The shield cracked. What had been hidden was now revealed in plain view. The manager's shoulders slumped, his silence turning into admission. For the audience, it was a moment of vindication. Corruption was not just hinted at, it was confessed through weakness. The twist did not come with fanfare, but with the quiet power of truth surfacing after being buried too long. Justice was not yet delivered, but the path to it had finally opened. The watchers felt the tide shift closer to balance. Then he called her forward, no longer hidden behind trays or shadows. The waitress stood in the center, trembling, unable to meet his eyes. Her confidence, once loud and unshaken, had drained away. "Why did you treat customers this way?" His question struck with the weight of all the silence he had carried. Her lips moved, but no sound emerged, the words caught in her throat. Around them, the restaurant was still, every gaze locked on her. Time seemed to stretch the air so taut it might snap. Employees waited, customers leaned closer, each heartbeat louder than the last. The confrontation was no longer about spilled drinks or missed orders, it was about the very core of respect, or the absence of it. The moment held unresolved, hanging between exposure and confession. For the audience, it was a cliff's edge, and everyone was standing on it, waiting for the fall. Her voice finally broke the silence, fragile and trembling. I didn't think they mattered that much." The words, weak and hollow, carried across the room like a confession no one wanted to hear. A ripple of anger spread instantly, murmurs from the tables, the sharp edge of disbelief in every whispered word. Customers shook their heads, faces twisted in outrage. Before the room could erupt, he cut through, his tone firm and steady. "Every customer matters. No one deserves to be treated as less." His declaration sliced through her excuse, leaving no space for argument. Her shoulders collapsed, her gaze fell to the floor, and tears slipped down her cheeks. In that moment, the balance shifted, her arrogance shattered, her cruelty exposed. For the viewers, it was the first breath of relief, the release after tension stretched too far. The false justification was destroyed, replaced by truth that could not be denied. Then he walked to the table, the one that had been off limits from the very first moment. The room watched in silence as he rested his hand lightly on its polished surface knuckles, tapping once-twice. His voice carried calm, yet unyielding. This table is not reserved for arrogance, it is reserved for kindness. The words struck deeper than any reprimand. The so-called untouchable table, once a symbol of her control, was stripped of its false power. Instead, it became the measure of humanity itself. Gasps filled the air, heads turned toward the waitress, whose face blanched with realization. The paradox shattered. What she had guarded with pride was never hers to claim. The lesson was now written into wood, and word status meant nothing, character meant everything. For the audience, it was the sharp twist they had waited for, a revelation that reframed every insult, every act of cruelty under a single truth. He turned from the table to the entire room, his eyes sweeping across every face. "I came here to find the truth, and I have found it." The declaration resonated like a final chord, heavy with certainty. Applause erupted first, hesitant, then thunderous, echoing against the walls until it filled every corner. The waitress crumbled, covering her face with trembling hands, sobs breaking through. The manager bowed his head, shame settling like a cloak he could no longer remove. And the young worker, the one who had shown quiet kindness, stood still, eyes bright with emotion, tears gathering, but held back with pride. In that chorus of clapping hands and unspoken relief, the room transformed. Cruelty had been exposed, justice declared, dignity restored. For the viewers, it was the moment of complete reversal, the release of every ounce of anger they had carried through the story. Balance returned, and satisfaction roared louder than cruelty ever had. He turned back to the staff, eyes resting on the young worker who had spoken little but acted with quiet integrity all night. "You," he said firmly, voice steady. "You are the only one who chose kindness when no one else did. For that, you will be rewarded." Applause broke out instantly, not tentative but strong, carrying pride and relief. The young worker's face flushed, overwhelmed hands shaking slightly as the recognition settled in. Around him, colleagues clapped with genuine energy, some smiling for the first time that day. Even guests joined in their approval, ringing clear. For the viewers, it was the release they had been waiting for, the moment when goodness so often ignored or hidden was finally given its rightful place in the light. The applause wasn't just for him, it was for the principle that kindness matters. In that sound, the balance tipped back toward justice, and warmth returned. He stepped toward the elderly man who had endured cruelty, then to the mother who had been scolded while holding her child. His words carried no hesitation. "I owe you an apology. You were treated without respect, and that is not who we are." He extended his hand, sincerity carved into every syllable. The old man's eyes softened as he reached forward, a weak grip but firm enough to convey forgiveness. The young mother smiled, exhaustion in her features replaced by gratitude, her hand meeting his with relief. Around them, other guests nodded, faces warmed by the gesture. The room no longer carried the weight of bitterness, but a quiet dignity being restored. For the audience, the image anchored itself deeply. Wrongs confronted not with excuses but with accountability. What had been broken was being pieced back together, one act of acknowledgement at a time. It was simple, human, and powerful. When the applause and gratitude settled, his gaze turned to the manager. The room hushed again, sensing what was to come. "You are suspended," he said clearly, his tone cold and final. "There is no place here for those who cover wrongdoing." The words struck with a force sharper than any raised voice. The manager lowered his head. No defense, left silence becoming his only answer. Around him, staff exchanged glances, nodding relief spreading across their faces. They had endured under negligence, and now justice was laid bare in front of everyone. The audience watching felt the satisfaction surge. The system that allowed cruelty to thrive was being dismantled piece by piece. This was not cruelty in return, but accountability, sharp and deserved. The moment carried weight not just as punishment, but as a promise indifference would no longer be allowed to shield injustice. For the first time, the air felt clean. He faced the waitress directly, his tone firm but steady. "I could dismiss you right now, but I won't." Her head lifted sharply, disbelief in her eyes. He continued, words striking with unexpected weight. "Everyone deserves one chance to change. This is your last." The room stilled as tears broke free, her pride collapsing under the weight of mercy. It was not weakness that spared her, it was strength, choosing compassion over vengeance. For the audience, the twist pierced deeper than punishment. The true power lay not in removing her, but in offering a path to redemption. He turned to the staff, his voice carrying to every corner. A single table can reveal a person's character. From this day on, we choose to serve with kindness. The words rose above silence, heavy yet freeing. Heads bowed in agreement, employees nodding as if a burden had been lifted. Then came the applause, loud, unrestrained, flowing from both staff and guests alike. It was more than approval. It was recognition of a truth everyone had felt but never spoken. For the viewers, the message crystallized: dignity is measured not by power or position, but by how we choose to treat others. The applause rose like thunder, sweeping away every trace of silence. In that moment, one truth stood unshaken. Kindness is not weakness, it is power. Power to restore trust, to build respect, to change lives. You hold that choice every day. You can look down on others and shrink the world around you, or you can lift someone up and watch the world expand. Choose to lift. Choose to act. If you've ever witnessed injustice, don't stay silent. Share this message, speak it, live it. Because who you are is defined by how you choose to treat others.